Good evening, Ben. How are you? Hello, Ben.
Hi there, how are
How
you?
are you? Good to see you.
I'm sorry, just having a little trouble getting on, but I think my connection's stable now.
You're very stable. How have you been?
Good, how about you?
Very well. We have been pleasantly surprised with how well this series has been going, even virtually. So we're
Excellent.
delighted to have you to add to that. You know, we had Ben Kiernan here last week.
He was my doctoral advisor.
I know. You were the one
Oh,
who,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
the
Oh,
one who said we must get you him for the lecture series, and so we did.
Yeah, I think it was nice for him because they've been in Ireland. They finally were allowed to return to the United States, so it's a much shorter time difference.
Absolutely.
It
And
would have
I
been
understand that you're involved in a 3-volume history of genocide with him.
Yeah, we're deeply involved in that now. I'm one of the co-editors of Volume 2,
Oh, I see.
along with Reeb Taylor, she's an Australian historian, and Ned Blackhawk, who's another historian in the Yale history department. And
Well,
so
that
we
sounds
have,
fantastic.
he probably told you about it. We have 3 volumes that have 29 chapters, I think, in each one.
Wow.
So I'm doing it because Ben is editing every one of those chapters and is also co-authoring every introduction and every conclusion.
Oh.
So
wow.
yeah,
That's a lot of work.
yeah, it's quite an undertaking. So
By the way, hi, Ben.
nice to see you. How are you?
I'm fine. Good to see you too. I'm excited for your lecture.
I know I owe you some forms. They will be forthcoming.
Yeah, I think you send them to our administrative aid in the political science department, so that would expedite your
Yeah.
payment, which we want to do. So
I had a chapter due for Sam for the new edition of Centuries of
Oh, the
Genocide.
Totten book,
Yeah, so
another edition. Now, that's good to know.
yeah, I just got that out a few hours ago, so that was a big weight off.
I'm sure.
Congratulations.
Wonder what edition of that is this? The third or?
Is it the 4th or is it the
Maybe.
6th? I don't know. 6th? I'm not sure.
Unfortunately, it sells very well. The topic never diminishes in interest.
It's going to be published by University of Toronto Press.
Oh, all right.
So
Very
it
good.
went through a more formal peer review process this time, I think, than before.
I see.
But
And are
this
you
is only the 2nd edition that I've been involved in. I hadn't, whereas Ben, I think, has been doing it from the
Yes,
beginning,
long time.
when it was Century of Genocide singular.
Oh, okay. Yes, that's right. Exactly. Well, we were very happy to have him, and I think he fit right in with this virtual process. It was his first PowerPoint, I'm told, but it was very detailed and very good.
That was
His first PowerPoint?
Well, he
My
describes
goodness.
himself as a techno-Neanderthal. And I said, I relate completely, Ben. Don't feel like you're alone. But it was very,
Well,
very thorough.
he has me being his map czar. So it's
That's a
crazy
good
to be
title.
making so many maps. I'm trying to research one about Southern Africa right now
Oh,
because the author doesn't really want to do it, I guess. So it's on me.
oh, fine. But you know, people don't understand the importance of maps. I mean, I'm having my kids do panels on various genocides right now, and I have to keep reminding them, you've got to bring maps to the party, or people don't understand. They don't know, they can't put it in relation to anything else, and they don't know where it is. And yeah, I'm glad that you're putting in lots of maps.
You know, a map that I thought was really impressive was the map in the beginning of Anne Applebaum's book, Red Famine.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Wow, what a map that is.
That's quite a work,
Yeah.
period, and so appropriate for our time. So
Have
are
you-
you working on anything singularly at this time, or is the?
Yeah, I'm working on a new book. I'm just about to go on sabbatical at the end of this quarter.
Oh,
So,
wonderful.
but I've been working on the Digital Atlas of California Native Americans.
Wow.
That's a project I've been really involved in. I helped start it. So we've been doing a lot of mapping there. So
Oh, sure.
all of the massacres and homicides that are in the book are on the website, and you can map them, and you can also go to the primary source, sources plural for almost every one of them. So
What a great resource.
yeah, it might be an interesting thing to use with your students, because they can then, for
Yes,
example, do research on Sonoma County, for example, and
wonderful.
you can look at things regionally that way. You can
Yes.
look by county.
Oh, that's great. Thank
Yeah.
you. That's a wonderful.
So but it's all kinds of things. The genocide is just one part of it. So it's also like a portal where tribes can load information that they want to share with the public.
Ah, well, that's a great opportunity for them. I'm sure they appreciate it.
And it's also things like you can look at California and see indigenous trade routes, and then see what commodities and manufactured goods go in every direction on these routes and between which tribes. And we also have been able to map the bounty land warrants. So where the militiamen who participated in the massacres received their land,
My goodness.
what counties, and actually see the parcels. So there's a lot there.
That is a lot. Yes.
Yeah. So I point students to it, and I don't quite know how to use it in teaching yet, but if you figure it out, let me know.
That'll be a first, believe me. Have me be the first to discover how to do anything technical, but it'll be a challenge. So now, are you doing your own book? You said you had a book coming out as well?
Well, I'm working on a new book. It's not nearly done. It will be about Native American miners in the California Gold Rush.
Oh my.
So
interesting.
Yeah, all the indigenous people that came to California and mined from Hawaii and Alaska and Georgia and New England and Canada, Mexico, and a lot from California, of course.
Yes.
So it's not really a genocide story.
No, but it's very
genocide is in the background, but it's kind of about,
the
idea will be that it may be that this is one of the primary ways that people survived, was by becoming gold miners. I don't know.
Interesting. How many people are we talking about?
Thousands, many thousands. So in the
Do you
first,
have stories, like anecdotes?
yeah. So in the first year of the gold rush, I think that a quarter to half of all the miners were indigenous people.
Wow.
Yeah, and nobody knows this.
No clue. That's so interesting.
I started thinking about it because, I don't know if you know, I was born in Redding.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
And there's a lot of things in Lassen County that are named after Hawaiians.
Yes.
And I always thought growing up that was really strange. But then I thought, in where I grew up near Happy Camp, and going through our ranch was a China Creek. And I learned as a boy that it was China Creek because of all the Chinese gold miners who worked in that area and were then driven out. And so I thought, maybe I should look into all these Hawaiian names up and down the state.
What a good idea.
And guess what? Those were all places where Hawaiians lived. It wasn't just like fanciful naming. So, the town of Cherokee over near Chico?
Yes. Yes.
So that's a bunch of Cherokee gold miners.
Wow.
Came from Georgia via Arkansas and Oklahoma and established that town. There's a town of Wyandotte also in the foothills, and that was founded by Wyandotte people who come from Lake Huron via a reservation in Kansas to the gold rush. So,
well, it's wonderful that you have enough native curiosity to look into these things and discover what nobody remembered. Huh? That's terrific.
Well, hopefully it will all be borne out, I hope, next year during the sabbatical.
Very good. Ben, I'm going to make you a co-host right now so that you can set up your.
Can I just Can we do share screen just for a minute to make sure that we can
Well, that's
see?
what you can do right now. I just made you a co-host, so you
Okay.
can now share your screen. And we're going to get off camera and I will introduce you.
Does that look okay to the two of you? Can you
Yes.
see?
Beautiful.
Okay.
That's perfect.
Yep, looks great.
All right, so I'm going to start our lecture series. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to again have Professor Ben Madley with us this evening. Professor Madley is an associate professor of history at UCLA. He was educated at Yale and Oxford. Dr. Madley was born in Reading and spent much of his early years near the Oregon border, where his interest in the relationship between Native Americans and colonizers took root. Much of his work is about American Indians, but he also considers colonial genocides in Africa, Australia, and Europe. He is the author of many journal articles and book chapters. His book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873, has garnered widespread acclaim. This book received the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for History, the Raphael Lemkin Book Award from the Institute for the Study of Genocide, and many other prestigious accolades. Our former governor, Jerry Brown, stated, "Madley corrects the record with his gripping story of what really happened, the actual genocide of a vibrant civilization thousands of years in the making." I have it on good authority that Dr. Madley is currently at work on a 3-volume history of genocide with his former dissertation director, Professor Ben Kiernan, who we heard from last week on Cambodia. We are always fortunate to have Professor Madley with us. We thank the Federated Indians of Grayton Rancheria for their support of his lecture. All yours, Ben.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome. It is a pleasure to be here again, and I appreciate all that you have done to organize this fantastic series. Before we begin, I'd like to say just a few words by way of preamble. I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Tongva Gabrielino land. And I also want to point out that the material we're going to be going over this afternoon is very difficult material. And if at any point you feel a need to step away to get a breath of fresh air, to say a prayer, please do feel free to do so. But I want to remind you that all of us this afternoon are on Indian land. In fact, anywhere you go in this hemisphere, from the shores of the Arctic to the tip of Patagonia, you will be on someone's ancient and ancestral homeland. So if there's one thing that you take away from our brief time together this afternoon, I hope it is that, the recognition that we are on native land. And now I would like to begin. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, the women's clamshell necklaces clicking softly against their woven seashell dresses. Male dancers, dressed as birds, deer, or hunters, supported the women in their heavy traditional regalia. Meanwhile, singers filled their voices with songs of knee dash or the feather dance. Between songs, the singers offered prayers of thanks both for the original creation of the world and its renewal in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away together under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through small round doorways into redwood plank houses with gently sloping pitched roofs. Outside, Lake Earl lapped gently at the shore. Inside, the Tolowa and their indigenous guests slept near kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that just 7 miles away, Crescent City men had established their own branch of California's ever-expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by California Governor John Bigler. He had shipped them 20 muskets, 95 rifles, swords, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill American Indian people. In the pre-dawn hours of December 31st, 1854, as many as 116 militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of volunteer auxiliaries, quietly surrounded the village and took up concealed positions in the brush, behind boulders, or in the shadows. At daybreak, as women, men, elders, and children emerged from their snug redwood houses to begin their day, the militiamen and vigilantes opened fire. They shot them down just as fast as they could reload, said one eyewitness. Possessing only 3 guns, the Tolowas and their guests were unable to defend themselves. A few plunged into Lake Earl and attempted to swim across to safety. They too became targets of sharpshooters who had been pre-positioned across the shore in anticipation of just such an escape route. When the shooting finally stopped and the screaming ended, perhaps hundreds of people were dead. Not more than 5 seemed to have survived. The attackers apparently suffered a single casualty, and the state of California later paid the militiamen for their work. This massacre was part of an American genocide. Between 1846 and 1870, California's indigenous population plunged from perhaps 150,000 individuals to not more than 30,000 survivors. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal reservations, homicides, battles, and hundreds of massacres took thousands of lives and hindered reproduction. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. Now, what do I mean when I use this politically charged, this explosive term? I have a very particular meaning in mind. Now, for a prosecutor in an international court of law to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they have to prove 2 things. You can see 2 of the elements here on this screen. First, the prosecutor has to prove that the defendant exhibited intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And this is what international legal scholars deem special intent, the particular intent needed to prove the crime of genocide. Yes, go ahead. Are you muted?
Ben, we only use the question and answer format. If anyone who has a question or a comment, please submit it at the end of the lecture.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the second thing that an international prosecutor would have to prove in a court of law in order to convict someone of genocide is that not only did they exhibit beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt special intent, but second, they have to be able to prove that the defendant committed at least one of the 5 genocidal crimes that you can see enumerated here on this slide. So what does the convention do for us as students of the phenomenon of genocide? Well, it provides us with a clear, internationally recognized legal rubric for evaluating instances of genocide, including historical cases not subject to modern day legal jurisdiction. So first, perpetrators must evince intent to destroy a group as such. And second, they have to commit one of the 5 genocidal crimes that you see listed here. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began reevaluating California's colonization by the United States. And by the year 2000, more than 20 scholars deemed California to be a case of genocide. Still, relatively little has been written about this topic, at least compared to other genocides. Building on previous scholarship, my book, An American Genocide, is an attempt to create the first comprehensive recounting of genocide in California between the years 1846 and 1873. Now, if you have the book, you can see that in its hardback edition, it's nearly 700 pages long and includes nearly 200 pages of appendices. Why did I spend so much time including so much detail? Because I believe that this topic calls for meticulous analysis. Why? Because the stakes are so high for scholars like me, for California Indian people, and for everyone living in the United States. If US citizens founded some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, upon deliberate attempts to physically annihilate the state's indigenous peoples, scholars will need to reevaluate some of the interpretive axioms with which we understand the making of the most populous and prosperous state in the most powerful country in the world. Scholars could, for example, re-examine the assumption that indirect effects of colonization, like diseases, rather than deliberate actions and policies like mass murder, were the leading cause of death in encounters between newcomers and native Californians. Exceptionalist interpretations of United States history also lose validity when we begin to compare genocide in California to genocides elsewhere in the colonial world, thinking, for example, of German Southwest Africa or Australian Tasmania. A careful study of genocide in California may also assist scholars in re-examining the larger hemispheric indigenous population catastrophe. Where scholars document a genocide, it will be necessary to evaluate the roles of governments and private individuals, as well as whether or not the event was part of a larger recurring regional or even national phenomenon. Larger questions then follow. What tends to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killings? Who bloodied their hands carrying them out? Why do we not know more about these events? Did democracy drive mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of the modern United States, Canada, Mexico, and the other nation states of the Western Hemisphere? The genocide question is, as I have learned through my visits with many different California Indian nations, particularly urgent for them. There are today approximately 150,000 California Indian people. In meeting with them, a number of questions have shaped themselves in my mind. Should they press for government apologies, reparations, and control of land where genocidal events took place? Will tribes marshal evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition? How will they commemorate victims of mass murder while also emphasizing accommodation, successful resistance, survival, and ongoing cultural renewal? The psychological issues related to California genocide are also fraught. What happens when a tribal member learns that she or he is the descendant both of a genocide perpetrator and a genocide survivor? How might California Indians reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, often at the hands of agents of the federal government, with their often intense patriotism? Finally, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have on the intergenerational historical trauma prevalent in many California Indian communities, and that trauma's connection to present-day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and suicide? The question of genocide in California under US rule also poses explosive questions for everyone living in the United States. Should government officials tender public apologies, as Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush did in the 1980s for the relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War? Since the publication of my book, we have seen a major public apology from the current governor of the state of California for this genocide. But we need to push forward with new questions. Should federal officials offer compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion Congress paid to 82,210 Japanese Americans? for their internment and the internment of their heirs during the Second World War? Might California officials decrease their cut of the $7.3 billion in annual gaming revenues that they took in 2014 as a way of paying monetary reparations? So a better understanding of the genocide that took place in California might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities currently seeking federal recognition. Now, the question of commemoration is closely linked, and that's quite a fraught topic right now. Will non-Indian people support or tolerate the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of the state's forefathers with the same kinds of monuments, museums, and state legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide or the Jewish Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in our public school curricula or in our public discourse? These questions are all quite important, but they can only be addressed in very limited ways without understanding relations between California Indians and newcomers between the years 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killing of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of US rule in California. But it was James Marshall's 1848 gold strike that precipitated a local genocide in the foothills east of Sacramento. Oregon men played a leading role in increasing violence against indigenous Californians. These Oregonians rarely had connections to the state's Hispanic economy and society, in which California Indian people played crucial roles. And many of the Oregonians saw California Indians as little more than dangerous obstacles to the rapid acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indian people increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines, which you can see in the center of this map here, where the gold rush was already booming. One 49er explained, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California, they did shoot them freely." That April, a man named Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, the town of Coloma at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had first found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indian people. Due to spotty primary source coverage, there weren't yet any newspapers being written or published in the central mines. We will probably never know the exact number of California Indian people murdered by newcomers in and around the mines in 1849 and 1850. But hundreds, if not thousands, may have suffered violent deaths there during this short time period. What was clear to observers was the exterminatory nature of the killings, both in their intent as well as their impact. In December 1849, Pomo and Wapo Indian people, held effectively as slaves, rose up and killed their two white captors near Clear Lake. You can see this marked on the map here as Big Valley Ranch, what is now known as Kelseyville. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and US Army soldiers killed as many as 1,000 California Indian people or more between December of 1849 and May of 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of indigenous people in the Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested some of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court let all 8 of them go in our state's very first Supreme Court case. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white slave owners. In an article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one San Francisco journalist described a massacre carried out by the United States Army on Clear Lake using information provided directly to him by a US Army captain. Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age was spared. It was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed. As many as 800 California Indian people died that day. Other killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured. In fact, they received promotions. One of them ended his career as a general, another as governor of the state of California. A new factor was thus at work: large-scale, extended vigilante and United States Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into California. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or maybe 14,000 non-Indian people living here. By 1860, census takers counted over 360,000 of them. Now, these newcomers came primarily in search of wealth, but in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their rapacious sexual desires, immigrants placed immense pressures on California Indians. These demands triggered explosions of ranching, hunting, mining, and slave raiding. These activities then generated shockwaves that had devastating impacts on California Indian nations, villages, families, and individuals. California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under US martial law, the military officers ruling California made indigenous people into second-class subjects with few rights. California's 1849 Constitution, written and ratified here in Colton Hall at Monterey, a state park that you can still visit today, then made it nearly impossible for any Indian to vote. And in 1850, California's first elected legislature banned all Indians from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from giving evidence for or against whites in criminal cases, and banned all Indians from serving as jurors. They later barred Indian people from working as attorneys and thus as judges. In combination, these laws largely shut Indians out of participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. Abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In 1850, California legislators passed the infamous Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing both courts and juries to summarily reject Indian testimony. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges for indefinite periods of time. In 1860, legislators extended the 1850 Act to legalize the indenture of any Indian. These laws triggered a boom in violent kidnapping while separating women and men during peak reproductive years, both of which accelerated California Indian population decline. Some Indian people were treated as disposable, unfree laborers. One lawyer recalled, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its slave mart, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way," end quote. Was this an exaggeration? I think not. Between 1850 and 1870, Census takers tell us that the Los Angeles Indian population plummeted from 3,693 to just 219 survivors. Escape was one way that California Indian people defied servitude, but whites sometimes responded to escape with lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki Indian woman Lucy Young, in portrait here, she escaped servitude multiple times. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver, front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither." Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled, quote, her lord and master with his Indian boy in 1858, vigilantes massacred some 15 California Indians. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River in northwestern California became so incensed after his 7-year-old Indian servant visited his family half a mile away that he, quote, slaughtered the whole family, about 6 persons, boy and all, end quote. Despite such reports, which were widely published in the newspapers of the day, policymakers failed to intervene, and almost all law enforcement officers turned a blind eye. Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, federal agents signed 18 treaties with 119 California tribes, allocating them 7,488,000 acres. We can see that land as the dark gray areas surrounded by light gray areas on this map. However, United States senators repudiated all 18 of the treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized 5 military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each and conferred no legal land titles. So you see, we go from providing 7,488,000 acres to a maximum of 125,000 acres. The results were fourfold. First, no reservations were patented, and jurisdiction over them was left uncertain. Second, because jurisdiction remained uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among federal and state authorities prevailed. Third, and this is quite important, California Indians did not become the explicit wards of the US government. Finally, US Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of California reservations' legal status denied them the Army's full protection. And I quote, "Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude the whites from entering and occupying the reserves, or even to prevent them taking Indians, including women and children." Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to kidnapping, slavery, assault, and murder. The establishment of California's militia system now marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine. Between 1850 and 1861, 3,414 militiamen enrolled in 24 volunteer state militia expeditions, killing at least 1,342 California Indians. However, their impact transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity for Indian killing and inspiring many more vigilante killings. Indeed, vigilantes murdered more than 6,400 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct. The following month, state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, an extraordinary sum of money at that time, for past and future anti-Indian state militia operations. Meanwhile, the state began building an arsenal in San Francisco of arms donated to them by the United States Army. Then, in 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow US senators that California Indians, quote, will be exterminated. Weller insisted that the interest of the white man demands their extermination. That same year, state legislators passed a $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations, even as vigilante killings continued. We can see here in this slide one of the bonds. We can see quite clearly that there is an indigenous person in the center, and we can see in bold writing, expeditions against the Indians. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, provided a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place during the 1850s. I want to warn you right now that this is quite a graphic description. Bell remembered, and I quote, about 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it into the brush where I ran and hid. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian. The United States Congress endorsed such killing even as state and federal leaders perfected the killing machine. In 1854, Congress allocated $924,000 to reimburse the state of California for its past militia expeditions. The following year, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibbe, pictured here, who ran California's militia system from 1852 through 1863, underscored the militia's genocidal purpose in his report to the state. There are but two alternatives before us, viz., either to wage a war of extermination or to abandon a large and productive territory. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibbe wrote a tactical manual and distributed it to his militia officers. Meanwhile, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis sent Kibbe U.S. Army tactical manuals to distribute to his militiamen. Then, in 1857, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in 1861, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to pay for additional California militia expeditions. Civilians and officials also carried out large forced removal operations to concentrate California Indians on federal reservations. These operations were often lethal. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 Indian people while forcibly removing one group to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoy Mut recollected that during the forced removal of her people to Fresno Reservation, soldiers killed 12 Indians. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man Andrew Freeman explained that when they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock and shot the old people who could not make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting tired. Once at federal Indian reservations, California Indian survivors often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his people to Mendocino Reservation, quote, "We were very hungry, and the Concows began to die very fast." Other reserves proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem led his people south to the Round Valley Reservation, where he recollected, and I quote, "There was even less to eat," end quote. Indeed, in 1860, officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Indians. By 1862, daily rations fell to 160 to 390 calories per person per day, further diminishing these already inadequate rations. Those who did not work were infrequently fed, if at all. If some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition weakened the immune systems of others, making them more susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing miscarriages and stillbirths. Some reservation officials and colonists used reservation Indians as unpaid laborers, with lethal results. According to one colonist, about 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in snow and mud. They were generally worked naked and packed 50 pounds if able. At California reservations, willful, sustained neglect took an untold number of lives. Federal employees also killed large numbers of California Indian people more directly. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 California men enlisted in the Union Army. Thousands of these men remained in California and soon transformed California's killing machine. As US troops, these so-called California volunteers, replaced relatively small, short-term militia campaigns with larger, longer army campaigns. The Army now fielded the most sustained campaigns yet seen in California. Vigilante operations flourished alongside these campaigns, but the genocide was now primarily a federal project. US Army forces killed substantial numbers. The first California Volunteers Army campaign in 1862 killed at least 120 California Indian people. Hundreds more would die in succeeding campaigns directed by men like Colonel Henry M. Black. California volunteers also killed prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how in 1863, had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabred. None escaped. McLaughlin concluded proudly, and I quote, "They will soon either be killed off or pushed so far in the surrounding deserts that they will perish by absolute famine." The US Army continued killing California Indians through the late 1860s. Even after Army officers concluded their last large-scale Indian hunting operation, the 1872 to 1873 Modoc War, they hanged and beheaded 4 surrendered Modoc prisoners before shipping their severed heads to Washington, D.C. The California Indian catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated, in both word and in deed, their intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed not one, but all 5 of the genocidal acts listed in the convention. Killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 separate massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that from 1846 to 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people, and probably many, many more. By way of contrast, California Indians killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indians during this entire period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing California Indian villages and their food stores while driving Indians into inhospitable desert and mountain regions amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Some United States Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered fertility while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, slave raiders, federal officials, they were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced transfers. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. In conclusion, sufficient evidence exists to designate the California Indian catastrophe a case of genocide, according to the UN Genocide Convention. Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created a California legal environment in which indigenous people had almost no rights, thus granting those who attacked them virtual legal impunity. Moreover, 2 governors threatened annihilation, and both governors and elected officials cooperated in building a killing machine. California governors called out or authorized no fewer than 24 militia expeditions between 1850 and 1861, which killed a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. State legislators also raised up to $1.51 million to fund these operations. By demonstrating that the state would not punish Indian killers, but rather reward them, state militia expeditions inspired an even greater number of vigilante killings. Finally, in 1863, after the United States Army supplanted the state militia as the primary state-sponsored Indian killing force, California legislators passed a bill allowing the state to raise an additional $600,000 to encourage more men to enlist as California volunteers. Yet the state of California did not act alone. Far from it. The US Army played a crucial role in the California genocide, first creating the exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating in killing, and finally taking control of it. In total, United States Army soldiers killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indians between 1846 and 1873. If state legislators were the architects of this genocide, federal officers helped to lay the groundwork, became the final arbiters of the design, and ultimately paid for most of its official execution. By 1863, the United States government had given California more than $1 million for its militia campaigns. Of course, by 1863, the United States Army had taken over as the primary state-sponsored killer, and Congress controlled that institution's budget as well. Indeed, federal legislators paid for some or all of many lethal campaigns against California Indians between 1846 and 1873. Like California Indians, Native Americans across the country suffered a devastating population decline following the arrival of newcomers. Before contact, perhaps 5 million or more indigenous people inhabited what are now the continental United States. By 1900, census takers counted fewer than 250,000 survivors. What caused this catastrophe? Diseases, colonialism, and war all played important roles, but was something more sinister also to blame? Academics and others have long debated whether or not Native Americans or any groups of them suffered genocide during the invasion of the Americas. The question of genocide in United States history remains an important topic, given that the near obliteration of the nation's indigenous peoples helped to clear the land. As in many other Western Hemisphere countries, the Native American population cataclysm in the United States played a foundational role in facilitating the conquest and colonization of millions of square miles, the real estate and natural resources on which the country was built. Thus, how we explain the Native American population cataclysm is fundamental to our understanding of the making of the United States. Beyond interpretations of US history, the stakes include issues such as public acknowledgement, apology, reparations, natural resources, land, Native American sovereignty, and national character. Despite these high stakes, the question remains largely unresolved. There are two factors that I would suggest tend to polarize what I call the American genocide debate. First, only some participants use the UN Genocide Convention as their definition, even though 147 countries have signed or are parties to it. A growing body of international case law supports it, and it remains the only authoritative international legal definition. Just as important, many participants in the American genocide debate emphasize rendering a verdict of genocide or not genocide for the entire United States before and after 1776, or even the entire Western Hemisphere from 1492 to this present moment in which we are today. Across the United States, American Indian population declines took place at different rates over millions of square miles and across centuries. Colonial, state, and federal policymakers all changed over time, as did their government's policies toward indigenous people. Moreover, hundreds, no, thousands of different tribes were involved. Their resistance and accommodation strategies changed over time, and they varied. Thus, despite the many published histories of violence done to Native American people by newcomers, the details revealed by this California case suggest the need for more local and regional studies to provide the data that permit an assessment of genocide's occurrence, variability, frequency, or absence in other regions, in the United States as a whole, and elsewhere in the Americas, from Patagonia to the Arctic. Assessing the question of genocide in the United States and beyond without an agreed upon definition or a substantial number of detailed case studies makes it difficult to reach comprehensive conclusions. The direct and deliberate killing of California Indians between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and sustained than anywhere else in the United States or its colonial antecedents. Yet there remains a need for additional detailed studies addressing other regions and indigenous peoples within and beyond the United States. The variables present in the California genocide did not recur in precisely the same combination or at the same intensities in the histories of all other Native American peoples. In some other cases, disease was the overwhelming cause of mortalities. Both state and federal or colonial and metropolitan decision makers were not complicit in every case. Other Native American peoples employed different survival and resistance strategies, for example, fleeing contact zones or killing larger numbers of colonizers than California Indian people did. Finally, in other cases, colonizers may have committed fewer or no genocidal crimes, while the causes and rates of death may have differed. We need to build, I would argue, on our existing body of knowledge with new research in order to understand the full picture for the United States, North America, and the entire Western Hemisphere. However, my hope is that this book presents a workable methodology for examining potential cases of genocide in the Americas and beyond. The UN Genocide Convention provides historians with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that may be consistently applied. Scholars should rigorously consider every potential case in consistent terms. Just as important, we should consider each on a case-by-case or region-by-region basis, not just in California, but nationally and internationally, to create a scholarly precision in our use of what is undoubtedly a politically explosive term, and to seriously evaluate the balance between variables like disease and the 5 categories of genocidal crimes enumerated in the convention. Thus, this book points the field toward clear and consistent definitional standards and application. Detailed case studies are a very important element in the field of genocide studies because case studies provide us with such a powerful tool with which to understand genocide and combat its denial and repetition around the world. Native American people experienced and reacted to conquest and colonization in varied ways. Rigorously examining this range of cases using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts will help to move the discussion of genocide in the United States and the Western Hemisphere toward clarity. Unbraiding each region's story from the tapestry of American Indian histories and bringing each into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of Western Hemisphere history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all Americans, both native and non-native, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.
Ben, thank you very much once again for a very moving and comprehensive study of our own genocide. And we have a few questions for you. I invite everyone in the audience to submit their question or comment through the Q&A. We have a comment from one audience member. I lived part-time in Round Valley. My property was within the reservation boundaries. I am not Indigenous. I studied the horrific history of genocide there. I am also a daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I've been studying the Holocaust for 35 years. I have felt that my personal background has helped me comprehend better what happened. What do you think about this?
First of all, it makes me think there's a lot about Round Valley in this book, and my whole project kind of began with a detailed case study of what happened in Round Valley. So I know that case quite well, and I actually went and presented my findings to the Round Valley community. So I think that is a case that we know a great deal about because I and other scholars like Willie Bauer and some others, Willie Bauer is a historian who's a citizen of Round Valley and is a professor at University of Nevada, Las Vegas. We've poured a lot of energy into trying to understand that genocide. I do think there is a kind of connection between Jewish people and Native American people. Certainly there are a great number of Jewish scholars who've been drawn toward studying this history, ethnography, and there have also been a lot of activists. So if you think about near where you are, the occupation of Alcatraz by the Indians of all tribes in the late 1960s. The press secretary of that operation was a Jewish man. I think 6 out of the 7 doctors who worked as volunteers on the island were Jewish doctors. And the San Francisco Bay Area Jewish community was, I think, played a fairly important role in supporting the occupiers in their protest of imperialism and colonialism in this hemisphere. I myself am a Jewish scholar, and no doubt for me, since approximately half of my family was wiped out in the Holocaust, that's probably part of what drew me to this story and continues to draw me toward writing about this history.
Another audience member comments, in 2019, I went to Cabello in Round Valley, Mendocino County to fight a forest fire. I had never been to Cabello and knew little about its history. Posters and signs were posted all over town that highlighted a 2018 abduction at gunpoint of a young 23-year-old woman. I kept up with the story, which is still unresolved, but I learned about the murdered and missing Indigenous women movement and history of massacres in the Round Valley from 1854 to 1859. My question is, Native American women are still not safe today. What needs to happen to promote the well-being of the Native women from murder and abduction?
Well, first of all, I'll say historians are usually not at their best when they try to make policy pronouncements. So I won't try to articulate a particular policy to remedy this horrible hemisphere-wide problem. This is a terrible problem in Canada, in Mexico, in Central America, and of course, in the United States and in many parts of Latin America as well. Clearly, there needs to be more attention brought to this. And fortunately, we live in a democracy, and it's up to us as citizens to participate in that democratic system. And I think to exert some pressure on our democratically elected representatives, telling them that we think this is an issue that is important, it matters to us, and that we want to see them put energy toward addressing. It is a major, major problem for Indigenous communities and one that really does need to be remedied. I appreciate you bringing it to everyone's attention.
How do people in these communities prefer to be referred to, as Native American or Indian?
That's a question that you should always ask the people that you want to know that answer from, because there is no one answer. In this book, I use the term Indian, American Indian. I also use Native American. I've generally found when visiting rancheria and reservation communities in California, the people prefer Indian. And I find that typically on university campuses in this state, people prefer Indigenous with a capital I. But it's always best to be respectful and to express your respect by asking someone how they would like to be called.
We just had a lecture a few weeks ago on the Great Famine, the Irish famine, and one of our students raises this question. Is there any research on Irish migrant participation in colonial extermination practices during the Civil War period or later? In other words, did famine migrants themselves fleeing colonial genocidal practices participate in another genocidal settler project?
Yes, I don't know that there's a study about that, but I will tell you I'm quite sure that there are many people from Ireland who came during the gold rush to California and after. There are certainly some Irish immigrants born in Ireland who led militia companies in California. And I can think of at least one who became a US Army general and carried out numerous campaigns against California Indians, but also against Native peoples in Utah and Nevada and Colorado and Idaho. So I think that would be a very interesting idea to explore. On a related note, there is a book by the historian Colin Calloway from Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. He's written a deeply researched study of the relationship between Highlanders from northern Scotland and American Indian people. So that is a story, a history in which he explains how colonialism in one place, in this place, Scotland, displaced people who then are involved in another colonial project in North America.
Why doesn't the US include more American Indian education, especially the genocidal acts, in our schools?
Well, it seems, I don't know the exact answer to that question, but I can tell you from talking to my colleagues in education, I have two colleagues who are in the education department here at UCLA and also in the American Indian Studies program, that the number of pages allocated to American Indian history in our 11th grade textbooks, that's the year when high schoolers typically study US history, has declined steadily since Ronald Reagan was president of the United States. So the high water mark was under Carter, and it's been going down since then. I don't know exactly what the reason for that is, but I know that here in California, whether or not things are included in the state educational standards has a great deal to do with what politicians and voters ask for. So before George Duke Majan was governor of the state of California, the Armenian genocide was not a required element in the state standards, but he made that so. And I think that political action also pushed the Japanese rape of Nanking into the required state curriculum. But if you look at the requirements for K through 12 in California, there's almost nothing about California Indians. So a couple of years ago, there was a non-binding joint resolution from the Senate and the Assembly of the State of California recommending that fourth grade teachers no longer do the fourth grade mission project. But there hasn't really been a substitution provided for how that could be solved. So with other educators, I've been working on alternative curricular modules, especially for fourth grade teachers, because they're not required anymore to do that mission project. So there are an increasing number of fourth grade teachers who are doing their own unit on California Indian history. But what we're hoping is that we can get a curriculum module together for every grade from kindergarten through 12th, because we are living on native land and we are living in a place of incredible linguistic and cultural and political richness. And I think at present, our state educational system is denying that history, that culture, that art, all of that from our students. And they really should have the opportunity to learn about the many, many thousands of years of human culture and habitation here in California that preceded the arrival of people who look like me.
What is your sense of the possibility of reparations being considered by the federal government? Is the time finally right?
Well, you know, everybody keeps saying we're in an era of racial reckoning, and maybe this is a ripe time to move forward with that discussion. Here in California, the official apology for genocide by Governor Gavin Newsom was immediately followed by his establishment of a Truth and Healing Commission. It's effectively the kind of TRC that we've seen in South Africa and Guatemala and Argentina and many places in Africa. We don't know what they will come up with, what they will ask for, but there don't seem to be really hard limits on what those folks could come up with in terms of an agenda or the questions that they might ask. But again, I would say this is very much in the voters' hands. And so putting pressure on your elected officials, if you think this is something that ought to be done, you know, you can pick up the phone as soon as this is over, or sit down and write a letter and send it off to one of the two California senators or to your local congressperson, and you can get the ball rolling. And, you know, when Congress decided to offer massive reparations to Japanese people who had been interned during the Second World War and to their descendants, that was a political movement. Senator from Hawaii got the ball rolling. And, that's also true with the general apology to Native people in this country by Congress. These are political actions, so they don't just come out of nowhere. They have to start with someone taking that first step.
Where did the practice of scalping come from?
Well, the genealogy of scalping is quite contested, but it seems that it has two different sources. So scalping and beheading was being practiced in the colonization of Ireland by English invaders. And Nicholas Canny, who is an Irish scholar at the University of Galway, I believe, he has written about the way that some of the same personnel involved in the conquest of Ireland were then involved in the invasion of New England here in North America. But there is also a school of thought that suggests that scalping is an indigenous practice to North America. But what I can tell you about California is that I found almost no instances in which indigenous people scalp non-indigenous people. Almost all of the scalping and beheading that I came across was carried out by newcomers against the indigenous peoples of California. And the details are pretty grisly and harrowing, but in this book, I describe people who were professional human bounty hunters, not hunting people to incarcerate them, but hunting them for their heads or for their scalps. And there was one of these despicable killers over in the foothills of the Sierras. He decorated a tree outside of his cabin with human scalps. Another one had a bedspread in his cabin made out of human scalps. And there are many stories recounted by eyewitnesses that are presented in my book of vigilantes making a parade through a town like Wairika, for example, with scalps on the ends of poles and riding through in a kind of victory celebration. On the Trinity River, in some places, people nailed scalps to the front door of their cabins. So this was an incredibly, surprisingly widespread, if absolutely horrific, barbaric practice, particularly in Northern California in the 1850s.
Can you talk about Bloody Run Creek, right in between Round Valley and Long Valley, and the massacre that happened there?
I am not familiar with a place called Bloody Run Creek, but if you know the date and the place of what you're looking for, you can probably find it in those 198 pages of appendices in my book. Every one of the killings that I found is listed there, both killings of Native people by non-natives and vice versa. And another way to find things, if you don't want to look at the book, there is a website that launched a couple of months ago called the Digital Atlas of California Native Americans. The Digital Atlas of California Native Americans has all of that material on killings, and it is roughly mappable and searchable. So you could probably look this event up, then you'd be able to see the primary sources that describe it, if those sources exist, such as newspaper accounts, official militia reports, US Army reports, so on and so forth. So we've spent a great deal of time digitizing all of that. And there are more than 300 massacres and hundreds of homicides listed there with their location, the date that they took place, the names of the people killed, if they're known, and also the sources that describe those events so that you can see them yourself.
To what extent did the presence of the Army set the views of so many settlers against the Native peoples? That is, were there any other major non-military agents in the extreme violence against the natives?
So the major agents of violence in this story are the United States Army, the state militias, and the vigilantes. Those are kind of the three sets of forces. And I guess you could also just say individuals, but I would collectively describe all those non-state actors as vigilantes. So the thing that the United States Army did that I argue is crucial is that in the beginning, they set the legal tone and they began the hunting of Indian people. Officers like John C. Fremont, with his subordinate Kit Carson, they committed the first really massive, large-scale massacre of California Indians by United States Army forces in 1846, even before the US launched its official invasion of Mexican California. So they started this pattern of mass killing of civilians even before the United States started to invade the state. The role of the Army is contested, though. There are scholars who have argued that the US Army acted as a buffer and actually protected indigenous people in California from militias and vigilantes. And while that was sometimes the case, there are a few times when that happened, that is overall not the case. And in fact, the US Army killed more California Indian people than the militias did. And that's not entirely surprising when you think they had little constraints on the size of their operations, the amount of resources that they had compared to the militias. So the US Army also had the newest weapons, whereas the militias had participants' own personal weapons or hand-me-downs from the US Army. The US Army had the newest rifles, the newest artillery, new saddles. And so they were unfortunately very effective. And I think overall we could say that while there were certainly people who tried to stand up against this genocidal process, there were journalists who wrote against it. There were state and federal legislatures who spoke out against it and voted against it. At the end of the day, the overwhelming majority of colonists and their representatives in the army, the militias, the state government, and the federal government, they all overwhelmingly voted for and supported this genocide.
A member of our audience says, "Thank you for your lecture. I appreciate your extensive and detailed research and your focus on such a traumatic subject. What role do you think American Indian nations or communities should have in vetting academic work about them, even if you are not focusing on one specific tribe? In what ways have you systematically integrated actual California Indian people into your research, information vetting, languaging, and image selection?"
Yeah. So the way that I went about this was by having engagement with a number of different tribes around the state over a period of about 10 years. And I took a lot of information to those communities repeatedly, and we workshopped effectively my material. So I wrote a case study about Round Valley, and I worked with folks from Round Valley, including Willie Bauer and others, made a public presentation there, got a lot of feedback. I wrote a case study about the Tolowa genocide in Northwestern California, and that involved repeated visits to Smith River Rancheria and several other rancherias. And you know, I'll tell you a story about image selection because we're looking at this image right now. There was a lot of debate initially among some Modoc people when I visited the Chiloquin community up in Southern Oregon about whether or not this man in this picture actually was a Modoc person. I had the good fortune to go out and meet with the Modoc tribe of Oklahoma. There are two big Modoc communities, both living in diaspora, one at Chiloquin in Oregon and the other in Miami, Oklahoma, near the Missouri border. And when I got out there to visit the community in Oklahoma, they really wanted this to be the cover of the book. And in the first meeting, they, said that this is obviously should be the cover of your book. And I said, but your relatives up in Oregon think that maybe this is an Arapaho man and it's mislabeled. And they were able to present some really clear evidence that it was Kintpuash, Captain Jack, one of their ancestors. And so when I visited Chiloquin again after my trip to Oklahoma, they agreed. And in fact, Captain Jack, this picture of Kintpuash, the last time I checked, is on the homepage of both tribal governments' websites. So it can be interesting to be a scholar and sort of be making connections between different communities and trying to figure out what to show or not to show. And you learn a lot by visiting Native communities. I'll go back for a minute to show you a slide that I learned about, again, from visiting a community. Give me a sec to go back here. Might be the very first slide. Okay, so this picture, you all are probably pretty perceptive and you can tell that this is a female person, which it is, but I wasn't sure. And when I visited Smith River and Elk Creek for the first time, people were able to tell me about this person and who she was. But then it turned out that a lot of the information they were telling me, they did not want published. So that was also something that I learned from all of these visits and conversations, was what to hold back on, what to redact, and what information people want to have shared versus what they do not. So I tend to be pretty careful about anything that I think might be culturally sensitive information. So I would never talk about where an acorn grove is located, for example. I don't talk about the healing properties of plants or animals. I generally don't talk about where a sacred place is located unless that's been specifically approved. So I'm quite a supporter of the idea that scholars should, whenever possible, be engaging with communities in order to try to figure out how to have best practices and be helping rather than harming.
Did you find any cases of these horrific intentional killings and other genocidal acts in Sonoma County involving the Southern Pomo, the Coast Miwok, the Wapo specifically?
Oh, did I?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Unfortunately, yes. Let's see, when we talked about, this is a map from the chapter called The Turning Point. And can you see my cursor if I move my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. So when I talked about those killing campaigns that followed the Stone and Kelsey homicide here, although the killings took place up here in Lake County, kind of on the border of a Wapo and a Pomo territory, the initial killings happened down here in the Napa Valley and near Sonoma and near Santa Rosa, right near where you are. You could, if you wanted to search for those particular things, those incidents, you would be able to find them using the index of the book. I tried to index everything with tribal names. That was something that I thought would be helpful, and that tribal councils and culture committees and TIPO officers thought would be helpful. So you could look up in the index, for example, you could look up Pomo, or you could look up Coast Miwok, or you could look up Wapo, and that would help you to identify some of those events. But again, looking at either the digital atlas of California Native Americans or the index of the book might also help to pinpoint some of those items.
Are the mass murders of Native Americans in other states and Northern American countries considered genocide, or is this strictly a problem for California?
Well, that depends on who you ask. my personal opinion is that there are many documentable genocides in United States history and in the history of our colonial antecedents. And I won't try to enumerate all of them, but I will say that I've just finished an article on the genocide of the Pequot Nation between 1636 and 1640 in Connecticut. And that is equally as thorough and relentless and awful as what happened in California, but it happened several centuries earlier and on the other side of the continent. And it's my belief that there are many more studies that need to be written addressing these kinds of histories.
Do you know anything about the current status of the Tribal Land Acknowledgement Act of 2020, AB 1968, which I heard about last year?
No, I don't. I mean, I will say it seems that in a lot of state entities now, in the educational sector, which is the sector in which I work, land acknowledgements are increasingly common. It is recommended, for example, at UCLA, that we articulate a land acknowledgement whenever we hold a major outward-facing public event. Obviously, we're quite conscious of that in American Indian Studies, but see that increasingly in play in many other departments as well. And it seems to be more and more common throughout academia as a whole to make some acknowledgement about on whose land you are a guest.
The Mishawai-Wapo tribe in Sonoma County is not federally recognized, and I know there are many others. Do you know if the Truth and Healing Commission is considering reparations for these communities that have been left out of federal programs? Any other thoughts on strategies on this topic, knowing you don't like giving policy prescriptions, such as land trust, tax movements?
Well, so just to the lay of the land, for people who aren't familiar with this. So there are 109 federally recognized tribes in the state of California, but there are also scores of other communities who are not recognized by the federal government. And that difference creates a huge gulf in the experience that a person, a family, or a nation has in its relations with municipal, state, and federal governments, and with education, and with the legal systems. So part of what's really complicated in California is that when termination was federal policy, that is the termination of federally recognized tribes, many California tribes that had been recognized by the federal government lost that recognition. So there are some tribes that have not ever been federally recognized by the US government, and there are also many tribes who have been recognized and were then terminated. Many have been re-recognized, including some on this map, in a product of legal cases at the federal level, like the Tilly Hardwick case, which re-recognized a lot of Northwestern California tribes, but also through congressional acts. So near you, for example, Grayton Rancheria was recognized by a federal act. So there are a variety of different paths to federal recognition. But I think strategies for federally unrecognized tribes in California is not my area of expertise, really, but it is the area of expertise for some of my colleagues, like Carol Goldberg at the UCLA Law School. She is an expert on this topic, as is my colleague Dwayne Champagne, who is a Cherokee citizen and is a member of the sociology department here. So I think I would just defer, maybe you can send them an email with your specific questions, because that's, I'm fundamentally a 19th century historian, so that's a little outside of my bailiwick.
What is your response to people who say this was so long ago? What aspects of the genocide can be seen in how this population is treated today in terms of racism, medical care, rates of substance abuse, etc.?
Right. So one thing we have to consider is that the United States is a colonial country. It has colonized the lands of many, many peoples. So I wouldn't say that the story was going to be a rosy one in California from the beginning, but the story in California is particularly shaped by a series of legislative policies made at the state and federal level. And one of the really key things from this period that has shaped California is the legal framework of state and federal policy in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. So had California's 18 treaties with its indigenous peoples been ratified by the state of California, by the US Senate, huge amounts of land would still have been stolen. I mean, expropriation of indigenous land is fundamental to the making of the United States. There's no way around that. But things could have been quite different had that not happened. And the way in which the federal government tried to solve this problem by paying out less than $1 an acre to surviving California Indian people later in the mid 20th century really didn't help very much. One of the fundamental problems in California is this lack of federal recognition that cuts many people off from federal health care and a variety of other Bureau of Indian Affairs programs. But I think, I guess I'll just say this as an educator, that the beginning to a conversation about what the state of California and what the federal government owes to the indigenous people of California probably needs to begin with a careful study of what happened here in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s. Because these issues, the genocide and the massive land theft, the stealing of children, the enslavement of human beings, these are fundamental to the making of Indian country in California. It's really hard to talk about the present without understanding this particular past.
Are there any programs that would memorialize genocide locations or tribes with plaques, like the Stolpersteine in Germany, to visually highlight the tremendous loss?
Well, there have been plaques put up. There have been, but they're often highly controversial and they're sometimes destroyed. So there's a horrific massacre that happened in the 1850s up near Weaverville called the Peanut Massacre or the Natural Bridge Massacre. And it's my understanding that twice a memorial has been erected there and twice it has been destroyed. Once, I believe, with dynamite, and once by bringing in heavy machinery and pushing the monument off the edge of the road and down into the creek below. Likewise, there's been a lot of controversy about monuments and a replacing of monuments. So if you look at this map, and you look at the location, Clear Lake Massacre, if you go up there, that land has been filled in. So what was once the island, known as Bloody Island, is now part of the mainland, but you can walk away from the road and go down and see the two monuments. And so there you'll see two dueling monuments with two different stories about what happened there. One more recent and probably tending more toward accuracy, and one much older and characterizing this not as a massacre, but actually as a battle. There are also places where indigenous people have protested monuments. When you enter Round Valley and you come up over the crest of the hill, there's a new monument there, but many people don't feel it is accurate, and so they have repeatedly poured red paint to signify red blood onto that monument. But this is again an opportunity for us as citizens in a democracy to take action. Caltrans has a person who works on these things. You can again talk to your state assemblyman and your state senator, or to our governor in a letter or an email or a phone call, and indicate that you would like to have the language on one of these markers changed. But I don't believe that there is any private individual or nonprofit group which is out currently seeking to erect monuments. But even if we just were to commemorate all of the major massacres during the 1846-1873 period, we would need to have more than 300 of these monuments. So it's a significant undertaking. One of the issues that it raises is the problem of whether or not the people who are descendants of the victims want to have that place publicly memorialized or commemorated. They may not want to, because they may not want to publicize the very precise location at which the event took place.
What's your opinion of how Native education should be structured? Should each state and region teach their local history, or should we have a general history that all states can use?
I'm really sorry I'm not a policymaker. I apologize for that. What I can say from having been on this commission, it's been interesting to look at what other states have done, because in states that have a Native education bill, they've approached it differently. So the approach in the state of Alaska is different from the approach in Oklahoma, is different from the approach in the state of Washington. So in Washington, for example, you need to teach the particular indigenous history of the land on which the school sits. But in other places, it's a much broader issue. What's very complicated for California in looking at an education bill is the many different communities that such a bill should represent and serve. Probably many of you know this, but there are more Native American people living in California than in any other state in the Union. And the majority of them are not California indigenous people, but rather indigenous people from outside, originally from outside the state of California. So there's a pretty complicated and long history of non-California Indian, but indigenous people living in California. So that is something I think that hopefully will be worked out in direct conversation with indigenous communities in California today. I think they probably need to play a really important role in such a conversation. So I would never want to hazard how that should look exactly.
Have you found that the genocide that happened here in California is fairly overlooked in high school history classes? This is my first time learning about the bond that was granted in California for militia operations and continued expeditions against Indian tribes that lived here. I feel the history I was taught never touched a bit on the actual genocide of the Indians here in California.
Well, that was basically my experience in the archives. This project kept getting bigger and bigger. And I remember finding one of those bonds for the first time. When it reopens, you can go and hold one in your hands at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. But I thought that was really amazing when I found it. And then I realized that over at the State Library, they have scores, maybe hundreds of these bonds. They have the different denominations, the big ones in a $500 denomination and the small ones, I think, in a $50 denomination, and everything in between. And they have them from many different years, and they have the logbooks that tell you which banks bought them and which insurance companies bought them and which individuals bought them. I didn't know any of that. And my sense is, at least from teaching in UCLA, my students, unless they are indigenous, they basically haven't heard about this. It's new to them. So I wouldn't feel bad about that, but it is part of why we are not grappling as a society in California with these issues. It's that most people just are completely ignorant of this history.
A final comment from our audience. As a descendant of victims, I would prefer the survivors and descendants be honored and living people be empowered and recognized.
Thank you.
Ben, we thank you so much again for a riveting lecture and an outstanding question and answer period. We always learn something new and we gain tremendous insight, and we will not be among the ignorant of the California genocide, thanks to you. And I hope you'll come back and be with us again next time in person.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you
Ben.
so much.
Good night.